of course, there is an attempt to sort of rescue physicalism, the notion that experiential states are caused by objective non-mental brain states, to rescue physicalism out of the clutches of this kind of results. And the most popular alternative so far is the so-called entropic brain hypothesis. And what people have seen is that if you study drug and placebo pairs, the level of noise or random brain activity that doesn't fit into any discernible pattern increases a tiny little bit for the drug compared to placebo. So if you have this scale of complexity here, at the top, one, it's TV static, purely random brain activity, uncompressible. And 0 would be only discernible patterns, no randomness at all. Then you see that the drug increases a little bit the level of brain noise. But by how much? Well, by 0.005%, 0.005 in a scale from 0 to 100. In other words, it's to say that it's tiny is the overstatement of the century. And by the way, for some of the drug placebo pairs, the correlation went the other way around. Brain noise decreased, and those people still had the unfathomable psychedelic trance nonetheless. So this borders on the ludicrous, I think. Researchers defend this by saying it's statistically significant. Well, let's forget for a moment that statistical significance is an entirely arbitrary thing. P-factor is entirely arbitrary. Even if it is statistically significant, it only means that the effect observed is not an artifact of measurement or methodology, that it's a real effect. But it's a tiny real effect, and it's preposterous to try to account for the mind-boggling richness and intensity of the psychedelic trance based on a percent increase in, of all things, unstructured brain activity, brain noise. But anyway, this is what is being attempted now. And it's not only psychedelics. People with tumors were studied for what researchers called an index of self-transcendence. In other words, to what degree these people identify themselves, not only with their body, but with something larger than themselves. And it turned out that if you have patients score in a form their level of self-transcendence before and after surgery for the removal of tumors in the brain, which always causes some collateral damage to surrounding tissue, self-transcendence increases after brain damage. So again, you have an impairment or a reduction of brain activity correlating with an experience of transcendence, like the psychedelic trance, or like this way of identifying with something bigger than oneself. And that's not what one would expect under physicalist assumptions. Vietnam War era veterans were also studied for their propensity to having a religious experience, which is also a kind of experience of self-transcendence. And people with damage to specific regions of their brain show a much higher propensity to this kind of religious experience. So again, enriched, intenser, broader experience correlating with a reduction or an impairment of regular brain activity, which is the opposite of what physicalism would expect. Trance mediums in Brazil, I reserve judgment about this mediumship stuff, but the result here is nonetheless interesting. They were studied under an fMRI, and they were asked to write down information on a piece of paper that allegedly comes from some transcendent source or whatever. And they divided two groups of mediums, what the researchers called less experienced mediums, which is their code for people who aren't really the thing. They just say they are. This is the control. These are not mediums. And what they called experienced mediums. And what you see is that in key areas of the brain associated with grammar, with linguistic work, with rational thinking, for the controls, brain activity increased when these people were writing down this information from transcendent sources. It consistently increased. No surprise here, they need to engage these areas of the brain in order to write text. But for the experienced ones, it only decreased it consistently decreased. Did they write less complex text? No. The text was scored automatically with an algorithm for a level of complexity, a measure of complexity. And in fact, the exp group wrote more complex text than the controls. So I could go on and on. I mean, syncope, when you pass out, when you hyperventilate, it's associated with transcendent experience as well. So what all of this leads to is the following, and I don't have slides for this, so I'll stop sharing and I'll go back to just talking to you. My hypothesis is the following. Out there is only a field of subjectivity, a field of mental stuff. We are dissociated aspects of that field. That's what life is. Life is what dissociation in this underlying field of mentation in nature looks like. It looks like metabolism. It looks like biology. In the same way that a patient with dissociative identity disorder, if you put that patient under fMRI, and this has been done in the Netherlands in 2014 by Jolanda Schlump and her team, you get a pattern of measured brain activity that is identifiable as dissociated alters. So there is something dissociation looks like even in the minds of people with dissociative identity disorder. So in this, for lack of a better expression, in this mind of nature that underlies reality, dissociation also looks like something, and it looks like us. It looks like biology, metabolism. And it is this dissociation that creates the division between the inside and the outside, creates the skin of the airplane, and leads to the emergence of a dashboard inside. So our internal dissociated cognitive states then represent external states, because external states impinge on our dissociative boundary. And we've evolved to pick out on that impingement and represent the respective information to ourselves in the form of what we colloquially call the physical world, the stuff that appears on the screen of perception, the stuff we touch, taste, smell, see, hear. And therefore, we are essentially mental beings. Our bodies are what our dissociated internal mental inner life looks like when it's observed from across a dissociative boundary. Physicality in general is what experiential processes look like when they are measured or observed from across at least one dissociative boundary. And that's why the world around us is physical, because we always observe the world around us through a dissociative boundary, our own dissociative boundary. And therefore, the states of the world upon measurement become represented within the dissociative boundary on our internal dashboard as physicality. And that's why when a brain scientist cracks my head open and looks at me, he sees a brain, or he sees brain activity, because that brain activity too is a dashboard representation of my mental inner life when it's observed from across one or more dissociative boundaries. Our brain activity is what our inner conscious life looks like from a perspective. It is not its cause. It is its appearance, its dashboard representation. And of course, death, the end of life, is the end of life is the end of the dissociation. And that's all there is to it. And if we see the world this way, even the psychedelic story I told you makes sense. Why do we experience, we have much richer and intenser experience during a psychedelic trance, even though our brain activity reduces? Well, because what is being reduced is the dissociation itself. The brain activity that gets reduced is what the dissociative boundary itself, the dissociative process itself looks like. If you reduce or weaken that, the boundary becomes porous, permeable. And of course, you experience things from across the boundary, because that's what reduced dissociation means. It means that there is more commerce of information across the boundary. And we call that a psychedelic trip. And again, Foundations of Physics starts making sense as well, because physicality is just representation. It's the result of measurement across a dissociative boundary. The thing itself, the thing measured is not physical. What is it then? Well, it is mental. Mental states are not amenable to description through physical quantities. What is the length in yards of your thought? What is the weight in pounds of your emotion? What is the angular momentum of your fantasies? Now, these are natural states that we know exist because we have firsthand acquaintance with them. And we know that they are not physical in the sense of not being amenable to description through physical quantities. So it's obvious what the answer to the conundrum is. The world as it is in itself is also made of mental states, not my mental states, not your mental states, transpersonal, impersonal mental states out there, which impinge on our dissociative boundary. We pick up on that impingement and translate that. That impingement is a measurement. We pick up on it and translate that into an internal representation that in turn is physical and can be described in terms of physical quantities. Physical quantities are descriptions of what appears on the dials of our dashboard. The thing measured and represented on the dashboard is qualitative, it is experiential, it is mental. And I'll stop here. Thanks for your time.